Yes, because mainly I loved the man. My late grandfather was the closest to me of any male in my family, including my father. He was the most extraordinary human.
He truly hated that person more than anyone else in the world, not through words, not through any public action, but through something far deeper than either of those things, through decades of silence, through nights spent sitting alone, turning over in his mind the names of the people who had made him feel small. David Suchet did not build his career on charm. He built it on control, on discipline, on a quiet, private fear that only those who have been doubted too many times can ever truly understand. And today, we are going inside the heart of that story. One man, 6 shadows, and a legacy protected with both blood and tears. But first, let me tell you who this man really was. David Suchet was born in 1946 inches London. His father was a successful doctor. The family had structure, discipline, and expectations. In that household, achievement was simply assumed. It was not celebrated, it was merely expected. And what does that do to a person? It creates seriousness. It creates the capacity to work without rest, but it also creates quiet fractures within, gaps that you spend your whole life trying to fill with perfection and never quite manage to close. When Suchet first stepped into the world of theater, he was not a star. He was one of dozens of people fighting for space. At drama school, he was respected, but not singled out. When he joined the Royal Shakespeare Company, he was not a leading name. He stood in the wings and watched other people draw attention effortlessly. He worked harder, memorized more, rehearsed more. But effort does not always fill the space that natural talent leaves behind. Then came 1989, and with it, the role that would change everything. Hercule Poirot, a character already carved into the public imagination long before Suchet ever touched it. Audiences had seen a version they loved. The press publicly questioned the casting choice. Some critics said he lacked warmth. Others predicted the series would struggle. Suchet responded the only way he knew how. He buried himself in the text. He read every novel and short story Agatha Christie had ever written featuring Poirot. Not skimming. He read to analyze, to understand, to become. He studied posture. He studied psychology. He studied the rhythm of the French language as it would sound in the mouth of a Belgian man. He built the voice syllable by syllable. He believed that absolute faithfulness to the text was the best protection he could possibly have. But protection creates friction, and friction creates wounds. Over the next 25 years, 6 men left their mark on those wounds. 6 men who never attacked him directly, but all of whom managed to do something far more unsettling. They forced him to measure himself without end. Number 5 on this list is Peter Ustinov. He was the first to create the shadow, and that shadow appeared before Suchet had spoken a single line of dialogue. Peter Ustinov had already played Hercule Poirot in several theatrical films before Suchet came along. He was expansive, warm, at ease inside the character, as if the character had been tailored specifically for him. Audiences adored him. Critics praised him. For many people, Ustinov simply was Poirot, long before Suchet ever walked onto an ITV set. The comparisons began immediately, and they never stopped. Ustinov was called natural. Suchet was called precise. Ustinov was described as magnetic. Suchet was described as technical. 2 phrases, a seemingly small distinction, but for a man who had fought his entire life to be recognized, that distinction contained everything. To be called technical is to be complimented in a way that withholds respect. It says that you are correct in what you do, but that there is no soul beneath it. It places you among craftsmen, not artists. Suchet understood that, and he responded by creating his own playing field entirely. He did not chase Ustinov's charm, because he understood that charm cannot be copied. Instead, he went in the complete opposite direction, smaller, tighter, more precise. He refused to let the performance appear calculated. He never tried to beat Ustinov on Ustinov's own ground. He tried to outlast the memory of him, but the wound remained. Because when a critic writes that you are technically perfect but colder than Ustinov, that is not merely a comment about acting. It is a question about your soul. And no one answers that question easily without being hurt. Number 4 is Ian McKellen. And this is the kind of pain that is hardest to describe. Not the pain of being attacked, but the pain of watching someone else do effortlessly what you struggle with every single day. Ian McKellen had presence. On stage and on screen, he drew attention without trying. His Shakespeare performances were studied, celebrated, analyzed. By the time Suchet was building his own career, McKellen had already established himself as one of the defining actors of his generation. They moved through overlapping circles. The Royal Shakespeare Company, the West End stage, British dramatic television. Whenever comparisons were drawn between serious dramatic actors, McKellen's name rose to the surface fastest. Critics praised McKellen for emotional depth. They praised Suchet for control. Just 2 words. But those 2 words carried a complete and unmistakable distinction. Control is craft. Emotional depth is art. And Suchet understood that in the eyes of many, he belonged to the first category. This exposed his deepest fear, that he was only diligent, not exceptional, that no matter how hard he worked, there existed something he could not learn, something that only comes from birth and cannot be trained into a person. McKellen did nothing wrong. He was simply excellent in a way that made others feel insufficient. And that is the kind of violence that leaves no visible marks, but it cuts the deepest. Number 3 is Jeremy Brett, the man who wore the detective's crown before Suchet ever reached for it. Jeremy Brett played Sherlock Holmes throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s with the ferocity of a man burning himself alive, intense, otherworldly, strangely magnetic. Many audiences called him the defining screen detective of the era. The press described Brett's performance as haunting, transformative, almost dangerous in its dedication. That mythology had power. It suggested sacrifice. It suggested a depth that lived near the edge of self-destruction. Set against that mythology, Suchet's controlled precision began to look safer, less unsettling, less extreme. The press ran analytical pieces comparing Brett and Suchet as though they represented 2 opposing poles of the detective art form on screen. Brett was praised for danger. Suchet was praised for meticulousness. One was celebrated, one was accepted. Suchet believed that faithfulness to Christie demanded restraint. He refused to turn Poirot into spectacle. But spectacle captures headlines, spectacle creates legends, and legends outlive precision. He knew that, and it hurt him, because he had disciplined himself tirelessly to perfect every gesture Poirot ever made, and still had to watch another man be lionized simply for choosing a more spontaneous, more dangerous, less grounded approach. He never publicly attacked Brett. He respected him, but respect does not erase rivalry, it deepens it. Because when the other person is genuinely gifted, the comparison becomes inescapable. Holmes was mythology. Poirot had to prove itself, and Suchet carried that burden in silence. Number 2 is Kenneth Branagh, and this is the most unsettling wound of all, because it arrived after Suchet believed the work was finished. Kenneth Branagh had no part in Suchet's early struggles. He arrived long after Suchet had already defined Poirot for an entire generation of television audiences. But when Branagh took on the role for the big screen in 2017, the old comparisons reignited. Branagh's Poirot was grand, emotionally heightened, broader in gesture and expression, a more imposing mustache, a more theatrical cadence. Backed by a major film budget and a global promotional campaign, his version traveled further and made more noise than any television series ever could. The press framed it as a reinvention. Articles asked whether the character needed a more contemporary energy, whether earlier interpretations had been overly restrained, whether the new approach surpassed the old. The language was polite, but language defines everything. Branagh brought scale. Branagh brought power. The older approach had worked with control and containment. For Suchet, this was not simply another actor in a familiar role. This was a question about legacy. He had invested 25 years protecting a meticulous interpretation. He had refused shortcuts. He had never softened the character for the sake of convenience. And now he had to watch the story being rewritten in front of him. The pressure arrived in interviews. Journalists asked whether Branagh had improved upon Poirot, whether the cinematic version surpassed the television one. whether audiences preferred new emotion over old control, polite questions, but with sharp edges underneath, Suchet answered carefully. He spoke about different interpretations, but you do not need to say the truth aloud for the truth to be understood. And the truth was that no one enjoys watching the work of a lifetime be questioned by someone who arrived later. And number one, the person at the top of this list, not a rival in any traditional sense, but something far more difficult than that. Laurence Olivier, a standard without a face. Laurence Olivier stood at the summit of British theatre long before Suchet had found his footing. His Shakespeare performances were treated as events. His authority on stage felt absolute. When Olivier stepped into a role, critics spoke of mastery, dominance, a command that placed itself beyond all question. For a young Suchet still trying to find his place, Olivier was not a competitor for any specific role. He was the standard that an entire generation of British actors had to face, the way you face a mountain, not to climb it, but to understand where on its slope you currently stand. Suchet watched Olivier perform and immediately grasped how far he still had to climb. The presence, the command, the complete ease with silence and with open space. It felt overwhelming. The violence here was entirely psychological. Olivier never mocked him. He never publicly challenged him. But his existence as a towering figure exposed every insecurity Suchet carried. It made diligence feel small. It made effort feel not enough. Suchet feared that he would always be described as precise, but never transcendent. Hard-working, but never luminous. Skilled, but never iconic. Olivier's shadow did not attack him. It simply diminished him. But instead of collapsing under the weight of it, Suchet went quiet. He chose control as his weapon. He chose faithfulness as his shield. He built a legacy on the foundation of discipline rather than brilliance. And the standard is still here. He spent an entire career pursuing that authority. He never surpassed that shadow in his own mind. He carried that comparison across the full length of his working life. And I must also mention Albert Finney, the man who reminded him that this role never truly belonged to anyone in particular. Albert Finney played Hercule Poirot in the 1974 film Murder on the Orient Express with the boldness of someone who had nothing to lose. Emotion visible on the surface, open, expansive gestures, not pure Christie, but full of life. The film received nominations for major awards. Finney's version lived on in memory as a cinematic reference point for the character. When Suchet took on the role, Finney's version was already part of the conversation, different in tone, less constrained, more outwardly emotional. Suchet chose the complete opposite path, a quieter scale, a tighter rhythm, absolute dedication to Christie's text. And in doing so, he unintentionally created a debate with no clean resolution about which interpretation represented the truest Poirot. This reminded him, and reminds all of us, that no artist ever truly owns the character they inhabit. The character belongs to the literature, to the audience's memory, to the movement of time. Suchet may have been the most faithful to Christie, but faithfulness is not the same as ownership. He understood that, and he accepted it in the only way he knew how, not through passive acceptance, but by continuing to work, continuing to refine, continuing to protect his interpretation until the very last day. In 2013, the final episode of Poirot was broadcast. Suchet had carried this character for 25 years, 70 episodes, hundreds of hours in costume, in the voice, in the manner of a small, brilliantly perceptive Belgian man. When the series came to its end, it felt ceremonial, quiet, and deeply respectful. But beneath that quiet was a man who had never stopped fighting. Throughout all 25 of those years, Ustinov was still present in the darkness. McKellen was still present as a reminder that ease is real, and that he did not possess it. Brett was still present as proof that mythology holds a power that precision can never quite reach. Branagh was still present as an unanswered question about the future of his legacy. Olivier was still present as a standard without a face, but felt in every single comparison. And Finney was still present as the reminder that this seat had been occupied before, and would be occupied again. But here is what I really want to say. In a world where spectacle is often remembered longer than honesty, David Suchet chose honesty. In an industry where charm opens doors faster than hard work, he chose hard work. In a career where so many people around him seemed to have it easier, he chose effort, and perhaps this is the most painful truth of all. That a man who did all of those things, paid all of those prices, carried all of those wounds, and still never felt that he was enough. But when I think about his true legacy, I see something different. I see a man who was doubted and kept going, who was compared and remained standing, who was questioned and did not bend, who built a performance of Poirot so meticulous, so faithful, so patient, that it became inseparable from the character itself. Think about this for a moment. How many of us have lain awake at night wondering whether we deserve to be seen? How many times have we heard comparisons no one asked for, and felt ourselves shrink because of them? David Suchet stands as proof that none of that has to define you in the end. Critics deliver verdicts, time delivers judgments, and time has spoken. For more than 30 years now, when people think of Hercule Poirot, David Suchet's name is not the second name to surface, it is the first, and most often, it is the only one. Not because he won every comparison, but because he never gave up. I will leave you with one final thought. There is a kind of courage that is rarely mentioned in stories about greatness. It is the courage of continuing when you know the destination may never arrive, when you know you will always be measured against others, when you know that effort does not guarantee reward. David Suchet lived inside that kind of courage every single day for 25 years. He did not compete through noise, he competed through endurance. He was not the most dazzling figure in British acting. He was not the most beloved, but he was the most faithfully devoted to a single character in a way that no one has yet managed to replicate. And that is why we still remember him. Good people do not always win. They endure, and in the end, endurance is the most memorable victory of all. This is the story of David Suchet, a man who resented the shadows around him and chose never to let them extinguish his own flame. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you in some way, share it with the person you think needs to hear it most.